Welcome, Dr. Paul Swan. It's wonderful to have you here again today. And today we're going to spin to win, simple games for using spinners. Now, I was thinking what the first spinner I would have ever used was, and it would have been for a twister game. That's probably the first spinner I had an introduction to. And these days, when we use spinners and I use them at home, we use even if we do games like Twister, we use dice and spinners together to make it a little bit more in depth. So touching colors with hands, and we do it 5 times and things like that. So I'm looking forward to seeing some interesting games that we can put in the classroom and at home.
So thanks, Heather. Hopefully there's a few ideas for us today, and I'm just going to take us to a PowerPoint, and then I'll share a few ideas about spinners. So the first thing I just wanted to bring up is this little PowerPoint that just indicates that ultimately there are all different ways that you can make a spinner, and I'll show you what I mean. And basically there are spinner uses for different purposes. So I'll just take us down onto the visualizer, and what you see here is I have an assortment of spinners from a suction spinner, which we'll talk about later. It can be very useful for lots of purposes, particularly if you wanted to put that onto, say, a smooth surface. So an example of that might be your sort of standard whiteboard, or for example, you might be using a write and wipe sleeve, that sort of thing. They fit really well on those, and we'll talk about that later. You have other sorts of spinners, so you can have like a spinner, in this case a plastic spinner, and you notice there's a couple here, different ones, and they just literally sit on top of a template. So I'll show you an example of that as well as we go. So you might have a sheet here, and that would sit on top of a template and so forth. And we've just put a couple of little feet on there. So even if you put them on top of one of these plastic sleeves that we talked about before, these write and wipe sleeves, they don't twist around and so forth. So that gives you that option. You could just make a spinner and simply by using a paper clip. And in that paper clip, you would then put something like a pen point sitting through there, and you spin the paper clip around the pen point. So that's another option that you could have that sits there. And a final option that I'll talk about just briefly is you can literally make your own spinner type game, and all you need is something pretty simple, a nail to make a bit of a hole. You'll see a couple of different nails here, and I'll take an example of a game that I've made, and here's one I made a little earlier, so to speak. So this is a game called Race Car Rally, and it's a division game. And you see, you may not be able to spot it, but I've put a little hole sitting in that spot there. And basically you take this 3-part spinner. So there's a base, and you push the base through the hole. So I've just pushed that up there. So remember, that hole was just made with a nail. Then you put the arrow part on the top. You make sure it's the shiny part goes down, the dull part goes up. And then basically there's a little piece that's a cap. You may or may not be able to spot that little cap. And then that just sits on the top and clicks into place, and you see now we've got a spinner. Now to do that, you take a game board, you laminate it. I have 120 microns for the bit there, so you'll get that sort of notion. That gives you a bit of thicker laminate, and then you can bang your nail through, and away you've got a spinner. So there's some options. The same sort of thing I mentioned before. So I've had that board, and I put that piece on there. It's a suction spinner. The nice part in COVID, you don't have to worry about licking it because it just sits on there and sucks and sits onto that point. So any sort of plasticky piece. You can also get a spinner like this, which is a case, and in the case you slide in a template, and then you slide the template in, and then you spin from there. So there's some various options that you might have for a spinner, and that gives a lot of versatility in that sense. So making the spinner is one form. The next key part is the template, or what you're going to put the spinner on top or pin the spinner through, is what makes it very interesting. So I'll take us back to our PowerPoint just to give you an example of that. So we've talked about all the variety of spinners you can have. Now essentially in there, they're the ones we've talked about, and just as a bit of an overview of what you can have in place there for that. So they're the ones we've just talked about, but here's the next bit. So they're the spinner that you can have. So we're talking about the bit, the arrow, the spin that you can turn around, but actually that's impacted by what sits underneath it. Now, we talked a little bit before about basically this little template that sits underneath it will make a difference. So this one happens to be in fourths, but you could have little markings to make your own. So an example would be, I'll just take you to an example of that. So that might be here. Pretty well anything that you can do with a dice, you can do with a spinner, but it's actually more versatile. So in this case here, you've got a 6-part spinner. That'd be the same as throwing a 6-sided dice. There's a 10-part spinner. It's like having a dice that goes from 0 to 9. So basically you put your piece on the top. So imagine you've got that spinner piece. You put your piece on the top, you spin, and you've got basically anything you can do with a dice, you can do with a spinner. So that's fairly obvious, I think. So it begins with the type of spinner you work on, and then you develop further the template that sits there. Now we've got a bundle of these sort of templates and spinner games just at our website. How you make your spinner could be just a humble one with the paper clip. That's fine, perfect for home use. That'd make a lot of sense in that idea. But let's just go a step further, because we're probably selling spinners short if we just talk about anything a dice you can do with a spinner, because you can do more with it. So just a reminder, you've got these options that would be here, but you could then put it onto a game format, and there's bunches of those. So once again, how you make the template part makes the difference. The spinner is just the randomness that's going on. So essentially the spin just gives you the random nature, and children love the idea of the spin to give that random nature of what's going on. It's what you put underneath that makes the difference. So let's look at a couple of other options that you can have with a spinner, partly why I like using spinners. It also is a little different to using dice, so just changes it up a little bit in that sense. So we've got a game as an example, but for example, you might have 2 spinners. So this game is a pretty popular game. I can tell by how many people download it, but in this point here, we have 1 spinner and another. So we're not restricted to the single spinner. This would just be like rolling 2 10-sided dice that go 0 to 9. Now, lots of people might have the standard 6-sided dice, but a 10-sided is a bit more specialty. So, you have to buy it from a particular shop or so forth. Whereas with a spinner and a paper clip, you can just emulate this 0 to 9 idea. I'll give you one other idea. So, for example, time. Could you imagine you had a little spinner template that had the numbers from 12 right through to 11? So you've got basically all your clock times. That would be there. So you go 12, 1, 2, 3. That'd be one spinner. On another spinner, you could have 5, 10, 15, 20, and you could spin, and the time might be 3:15, 4:20, 8:50, and then you could show that on an analog clock, with the hands. So that's the versatility of a spinner. You could have 2 that are sitting side by side. So can you start to see now that the spinner is giving you a bit more versatility in this point. But there's a couple of other things that I think are really neat with a spinner. So let me point them out for you. Okay, so here's another one for you. We could actually have colours or different letters in there, or spire spinners. So for example, a spinner might be used for probability or chance. And one of those you might say, well, what's the chance of it landing on green? What's the chance of it landing on blue, and so on, red and yellow? So in other words, there's a bit of a bias there, that there's more chance that it lands, say, on a green than it lands on a blue, and so forth. Now, we've got a very interesting one there, because you can see that the area is actually quite different for that. There's one where the pink area is very small, but actually when you think about the spinner, what we're talking about is it's spinning around the edge or the circumference of the circle. So the advantage of a spinner is you can start playing with them, and I like to use the expression playing with kids' heads, about them thinking now, well, what's the implication that would sit in this point here? It's not your stock standard sort of obvious spinner. Now you may notice one other thing here, that what we've done in this spinner, there's an extra little circle around the middle, and that's designed so that when you've got, say, one of these suction spinners, so that when it sits inside the sleeve, so remember we talked about you might take that spinner on a bit of paper, you put it into one of those right and wipe sleeves, and then you can put your spinner on it. Well, that little extra circle in the middle just helps you to position it in the right spot so that it's right in the center. So even the design, so just have a bit of a look there, there's that extra circle in the middle. That means I can take this spinner, put it in the right space so that I'm not getting an impartial spin. I'm getting a fair spin that happens. Now you'll notice one other spinner there. It's got letters on it. So suddenly your spinner doesn't have to be all about just numbers or colours. It could be shapes, it could be numbers, it could be letters, it could be words. See, the versatility of the spinner gives us a lot of opportunity. So at the start, as you mentioned, like twister, so we could have landing on a colour or a shape, or or for example, you could have two spinners at this point, a bit like I talked about with the time. You might say, well, I want red, the colour red, on one spinner and square on another spinner. So you could have a colour and a shape and so forth. And so what I think is spinners are very versatile and allows us to do everything that you can do with dice and some more. And I just wanted to illustrate that a little bit with you. So I'm going to take us through just a couple of ideas and activities to build that. As I said, you can download lots of spinner games from my website. More than welcome to do it. And if you're at home, simple, paper clip and a pen will do fine. But if you're in a school environment, you might want to streamline some of that sort of idea. So now I'm going to set up a little task, and I call it Secret Spinner. And just because I've used the word secret, children think, well, this is going to be really interesting. Now, the way the task works, if you're going to follow along, is I need you to keep some tally marks. So every time a certain colour is going to come up, you put a tally mark. So if a colour, so I'm going to take a spinner right now, and I have some interesting templates here. And I'm going to spin, and as I spin, I'm going to call out a colour, and if you can keep a track. Now, I'm going to spin 10 spins, and if you keep track of that, we'll get a bit of an idea what we think the spinner might look like. So this is some serious problem solving and reasoning. Now, bearing in mind that in the short run, anything can happen in mathematics. In probability, it's the long run where we get the better understanding. So in a short run, anything could happen. So ready? I'm just going to spin now. Now spin fairly quickly, but I'll put my spinner template on. I can't show you because otherwise that'd be giving the task away. But I'm going to spin and I'm going to tell you that we just spun a red. Okay, I'm going to spin again, and we did red again. Now at this point, if I said to you, what does a spinner look like? The only thing that you know is that it's red, but you're probably guessing it's not all red in this case here. So we're keeping our tally marks, and I've got 2 marks next to red. They'll be here. I spin again. Whoa, I got a yellow. So that's telling you some really useful information. It's not just about red. There's another colour on that spinner. Let me spin again. And you guessed it, come up red again. So it seems to be there's a lot of red and a little bit of yellow. So I'm going to spin again. And guess what? Red again. Wow. So by my tokens here, I think there's 4 reds and a yellow at this point. So let me just try and spin maybe in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction. Some children think it makes a difference. Well, and it did. I've got a yellow. So, well, that's telling me a little bit. So I think I've got 4 reds and 2 yellows. I've got a couple more spins yet. And away I go. And wow, that's really useful. I've got a green. So that's useful information for me. So I've got 4 reds, a yellow, 2 yellows and a green. So I've done 7 spins. Let me spin again. Oh, and guess what? I got another red. So I think we now have 5 reds, 2 yellows and a green. Let me spin again. Oh, and I've got another green. So that's 2 greens. And I've got 1 more spin. So who knows what might happen at this point here. Okay, so I'm going to spin. And, I got another green. So far what I can say, if we're starting to think about this now, remembering it's only short run, so as I said, the results could be all over the place. But if I ask children now to draw their spinner, here are some things that they might be able to say. I think about half of it looks like it's red. Might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less. I think maybe a quarter of it is yellow. And I think maybe a quarter of it is green. So you start to see we've got a little bit of reasoning. Maybe there's a little bit more green than there is yellow. And we're starting to get a bit of a feel for this, what I call the secret spinner. Kids love this sort of activity, but it's not just about spinning to get numbers. It's now getting your thinking going. So let's take it a little step further. Imagine I spin some more, and I won't take up all the time of the session today, but imagine I spin some more, and I'm going to give you 10 more spins, and I'll tell you what the data is. Okay, so for your benefit, we've actually, over those 10 spins, I've spun another 5 reds, so there's 10 reds altogether. So that's pretty consistent. There seems to be a large chunk of my spinner is red. Okay, when I spun a little bit more, there were actually, in this case here, 6 greens. Okay, 2 yellows, and surprise, surprise, 2 blues. So now I've got a bit of a different idea of what my spinner might be, because we collected more data and we found that, so roughly it might be, this is not perfect because we've only had 20 spins, that I've got 10 reds, so it's about half the spinner. I got about 6 greens, so that's about maybe a quarter of the spinner. And now the other quarter is broken into 2 halves, maybe a yellow and a blue. Now, once again, more spins, we'd find out sorts of things that would happen there. Now, if we just have a bit of a look, as an example, I didn't use the same colours that are up on the screen, but just to give you an example, you can see there's a spinner there, and it's got half of it happens to be green. So if I use that spinner and did some spins, you'd expect over the long run, let's say there was 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 spins, about half of them to be green. There's blue on there. So over the very long run, you'd expect about a quarter of them to be blue. Likewise, in the long run, lots of spins, you'd expect, in this case here, I reckon 1/8 of them to be red and 1/8 of them to be yellow. Now that's never going to be perfect, but it gives you an idea of how we might use spinners to simulate some ideas and so forth. Now, there is another side to spinners. You can go online and click and get lots of spins and so forth in the long run. But I find I've had quite a few discussions recently about screen time and physical sort of stuff. I'm not against screen time, but there's something about being able to take a little spinner and flick it and get that physical sort of notion. There's a notion of play and so forth. The other side about being able to grab a spinner is, imagine once I've got this size and I can draw the template, the children can make their own spinners and they can make their own games that would sit there. Now, to give you an idea, I'll take you back to the slide that we have. One of those slides spells out the word skater. So it's got SKATENR. And, it's talk about we want to win a skateboard. And we got to spin, and we got to keep spinning until we get the word skater. Now, in an ideal world, children would love it if it only took 6 spins, you got an S and you got a K and you got a... But in the reality, that's not true. It might take me 12 spins. It might take me 14 spins. It might take me 11 spins to collect one of each letter, but you might then have 5 of one letter and only 1 of another. So that's typical of the sort of competitions you often see where you go collect things in packets and so forth. So in this case here, you could keep spinning till you find out how many spins on average it takes you to get at least 1 of each of the letters. As I said, you might end up with 3 S's and 2 E's, but no R's. So you've got to wait till you get 1 of each letter. So essentially, I like the versatility of spinners in that sense. So it's not just about numbers and doing the things that dice do, it's a bit more. I'd just like to give you a couple of other options that you might want to do with a spinner. One would be, we talked about before, it doesn't have to be just one spinner. You can have 2 or more. So like I talked about at the time spinner with the 12, 1, 2, 3, and then on the other side 5, 10, 15, 20. That would give you 2 spinners, could give you the time to 5-minute intervals. Or in the game, the erase game, you have 2 spinners that go 0 to 9. Well, let's just talk about numbers and the way we talk about numbers a little bit. And I'll show you a different example of a spinner. Okay, so we just looked at those ones, but now we might look at this idea. So now we put 3 spinners together, and if we spin that up, we might get a number like 874. Now the US, they would say 874 without the and in it. So, whatever the local way of saying things is the way that you should use. But in this case here, we put 3 spinners together and we will do a 3-digit number. So for example, I might spin up a 3-digit number and then say, well, let's make it with the base 10 materials, with the flats and the longs and the units. So if I spin up 564, can you show that to me in the base 10 materials? Could you show that to me with maybe arrow cards or Montessori cards, those cards that overlap on each other? Could you show that to me on a 3-prong abacus? So the spinner itself is generating the work rather than that grumpy teacher asking you to do stuff. It can be basically the spinner's asking you to do some things and so forth. And that's just the advantage you get by having put 3 spinners together. So this would link you with your place value materials and any other materials. As I said, a 3-prong abacus, your base 10 or MAB materials, all of that would link with this. Now, if we take it a step further, later on we're looking for a pattern in the way that we say our words or place value. So if we look at this one here, all I've done now is taken the one set of 3 and put them together, and now we've got the millions, thousands, ones. So we're starting from the left. It might be 956,472,561. So you start to group them together. Now the fun part about this is I let children go as far as they can get trillions, what number comes after trillions and all of that, and spin them out. Now you can't show that with materials, that's pretty obvious, but you're getting the language pattern of what happens there. So ultimately we've moved basically from a single spinner, and the basic ideas of whether we use a paper clip, whether we use a plastic spinner, whether we put a suction spinner on. They're the general tools that we would use. Okay. The next bit is we need a template that sits underneath that. Now, whether you put it in a right and wipe sleeve and then put your suction spinner on, whether you place your spinner on the top, it doesn't really matter. But now the world's your oyster, so to speak, because if you've got the template, you can change what's on the template. Now think, we've done so far numbers on the template, colours on the template. The template's been a bit biased at times, so it's not always even. And we put letters on the template. We've also said, well, hang on, you don't have to have one spinner. You can have 2 or more multiple spinners. And that's why I like spinners, because they're sort of very versatile. So hopefully there's a little bit of an overview of all the things you can do with spinners. Look, even if you just have the paper clip spinning around your pen, there's a lot of things that you can do with a spinner. So hopefully there's a few ideas there, Heather.
Paul, thank you so much. I love the secret spinner. It's kind of like the barrier games when you don't really know what you're going to get in. You don't know what's the end result. And it could be absolutely perfect, or it could end up as a really interesting experiment of what they see. Also, lots of games to play and learn, and just add together from multiple ages and multiple, even without language or with language. So I could do that with one of my smaller children as a toddler, with colours and shapes and things like that, rather than having numbers where his numeric value is not actually too fantastic yet. Whereas the older child, I could do it, as you said, with trillions. He would love that. They would absolutely love that. But in the classroom at home. So the webinar will be available on YouTube, and also all the amazing games. Go to drpaulswan.com.au and just look up. There's a lot of games, not just with spinners, but there's a lot of other games for place value, multiplication, and books from Dr. Paul Swan. So thank you very much to the team.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you very much.